Hello, my name is Dustin Thompson, and this is the Sierra Club's presentation on giving effective public comment and testimony in Delaware. I started working for the Sierra Club in 2019 as an organizer, and I now, as of August 2022, am now the chapter director for the Sierra Club Delaware chapter. And I'm very excited to share this training with you to help motivate you and assure you that you too can give effective public comment and share your stories. So today we're going to go through some various types of testimony, some writing structures that can help guide your testimony, some tips for writing and tips for delivery. So there's more than one way to tell your story, and it's important for you to decide which method works best for you in your particular circumstance. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means. There are other types of testimony that are out there. These are just 5 of the most common that we see and hear and have helped develop. So each of these can work for different situations. So I want to give just a few examples of some of these different types of testimony. So creative testimony essentially is creative storytelling or imaginative storytelling. So it's not necessarily your specific story, but a story more broadly that helps emphasize the point that you're trying to make in your verbal or written testimony. Personal story is as it sounds. It's the type of testimony that most folks use if they're trying to let decision makers know how they've been personally, or their family or immediate circle has been personally impacted by a decision or lack thereof. Persuasive testimony can look like many things, but essentially you're choosing to dive into a couple key points that will help persuade decision makers to go in your direction, whether you want them to vote in favor or against. Data-driven testimony is often used by those within industry or with a science background. It gives specific data points that can help guide decision makers to ultimately make the decision that you would like them to make. Questioning testimony is a little bit different. Instead of picking out data or being persuasive directly or sharing a personal story, you're asking key questions that decision makers should consider before ultimately making their decision. Now, this one is a bit risky for 2 reasons. One, if done wrong, it can come off as condescending, which ultimately usually has a negative impact on your ability to effectively deliver your testimony and influence decision makers to go your way. 2, you will not be receiving answers to your questions during the delivery of your testimony or during the public comment period. Oftentimes, with permitting decisions, you will never be answered any questions that you ask the permitting agency. Oftentimes, they will release documents well after the public hearing that seeks to address any questions that come up during the public hearing process. They are not likely to answer your questions that day, nor is the applicant applying for permits. When delivering questioning testimony to legislators, again, it is not likely that a conversation will ensue with decision makers. If you're representing an organization, it is possible that you are questioned by decision makers, particularly legislators and committees. But it's not likely, if you are an individual only representing yourself, that a conversation will ensue after you've asked questions of the decision maker. So the goal here really is, without being condescending, to make sure decision makers are considering what you have determined to be key points or key questions before they ultimately make a decision. So it's important, if you're going to use the questioning style of testimony, that you understand these facts going into it. Likewise, if you're trying to deliver a personal story or you are personally impacted, perhaps a data-driven testimony approach is not the best way to go about it. we often hear that legislators are heavily influenced by personal story types of testimony rather than data-driven testimony. So if you have a personal story to tell, especially in legislative committees or county level committees, whether they be state or legislative, those kinds of decision makers often have more room for interpretation and flexibility in their ultimate decisions. Whereas if you're delivering testimony during a public hearing on a permitting process, personal stories do not ultimately usually enter into the decision-making process for the secretary of the agency that ultimately has to make the decision. These are perfect times for more data-driven or persuasive testimony that relies more on facts and key points rather than personal stories or narratives. We're going to deep dive a little bit more into persuasive testimony in a second, but just know that each of these types of testimony have a time and a place, but it's important to think about why you want to testify and let that be your guide on the choice and type of testimony that you're going to ultimately deliver. If you do not have a personal story and you're just making up a story or you're trying to be creative in your storytelling, that may not be the best thing during a permit hearing. But if that is what you have to share, you should share that story. Next, I want to talk about writing structures. Writing structures essentially keep your testimony moving forward and prevents you from doubling back on yourself and repeating yourself, and thus just simply wasting your time, which is very limited during giving public comment. So there's a lot of different writing structures out there. Again, these are just 4 examples. Monroe's motivated sequence is probably my favorite type of writing structure. It's the most commonly used. It's the easiest for those who are unsure of how exactly to start writing. And it tends to lend itself to the short time window that we have when giving verbal public comment. When you're delivering written comment, the story structure, and more realistically, the formal writing structure, is often used and is very easy to use, but it is hard to develop a full testimony that can only be given in a maximum usually of 3 minutes using the formal writing structure. So in this case, we're going to focus on Monroe's motivated sequence. This is Monroe's motivated sequence as a glance. Essentially, you start out, as you always do, introducing yourself and your organization, and then immediately dive into what's called a hook, an attention-grabbing statistic, data point, fact, or even in some cases, if you're doing a personal story, the culmination of your story, where the story ends, something that is upsetting and will get the attention of decision makers and make sure they're paying attention to the rest of your testimony. So this is where you draw them in and make sure that they're listening. Next, you move into essentially the problem. What exactly are you trying to solve, or that this policy that you're testifying on is trying to solve? What is the need? You don't want to spend a lot of time developing the need because most decision makers will know what the problem is, but you also do not want to ignore it. Then you would move into the solution. How does what you're testifying on ultimately impact the problem? For example, if there's a bill you do not want to pass, then passing this bill would ultimately either have a negative effect on the problem or no effect at all, which can also be negative. So it doesn't have to be that the solution always fixes the problem. Sometimes you want to prevent it from making the problem worse, and the solution isn't really a solution at all. It's a proposed solution. Likewise, if a bill is going to fix a problem, then you want to highlight how it's going to fix the problem. Then you move into visualization. What would it look like if this solution was passed or approved in terms of the problem. What would the future in your community, in the state of Delaware, or nationally look like if decision makers went the way you would like them to go? So you're helping them visualize the problem, the solution, and what would happen if they go your way. And then you simply end on asking them to do whatever it is that you would like them to do. Support this bill, reject this permit, approve this permit, support this ordinance, whatever the call to action is. I know this was a good amount of information, and the big thing at this point is not to panic. Everybody can choose different writing structures and different types of testimony. And it can start off a little bit daunting, but practice makes perfect. And guides and outlines can help. So make sure you lean on those online tools and just practice. Now for some tips for writing. The choices you make before you begin to write are just as important as what you ultimately decide to put down on that paper. So before you write, read the policy, the permit, the ordinance, the regulation, whatever it may be, in full. Now, realistically, most people are going to have trouble with this. Regulations and laws and ordinances and permits are all very confusing and are not designed and written for lay people, for the average Delawarean. And that's why it's important to reach out to organizations. One of the biggest messages and takeaways from this conversation is that you should know that you're not alone. Whatever issue that you are working on, I guarantee that there is some organization out there that is also touching on this issue. It's up to you to not only read the policy, but to research the organizations that are out there and reach out to both coordinate your efforts and to seek clarification on the complicated issues that are often being dealt with during times of which you will be delivering public comment. Next, decide why you want to speak. What do you bring to the table? And that should guide what kind of type of testimony you would like to write. And that will ultimately help you decide what structure you want to follow as you're writing. Now, some of those writing structures do really well with each other. For example, the artistic writing structure, which tends to be more free-flowing, does really well with creative writing. But it does not do very well with data-driven writing. Likewise, the formal writing structure does really well with data-driven writing, but not so much with creative writing. Now, there's a lot of crossover. You can use Monroe's motivated sequence to write just about any writing type of testimony. So it ultimately is up to you on both what you're comfortable with, but also what fits why you want to speak as well. Then you want to brainstorm 2 or 3 policy questions on which you would like to focus. One of the biggest mistakes that we see is people having too many points in their testimony. They ultimately end up running out of time and overwhelming the decision maker, which usually ultimately leads to them ignoring the testimony. This is not obviously an effective way to go about things. And I can't stress this enough. You must research before you write. Researching for data in particular, after you have written, only serves to confirm your biases. And so you want to research the problem, the policy, the organization's working on it. Let that inform you before you write. So while you're writing, again, don't have too many points. Bombarding decision makers with data is not ultimately going to win the day. Because if they have to pick out the 1 or 2 points that really matter to them and to you, they're not likely going to do that. They're more likely just going to ignore what it is you have to say. So pick 1 or 2 things and focus in on them. Again, this is when coordination with organizations can help, because they can help divide up all the many points that are out there on any given issue. For your own sake, avoid writing in large blocks of text. When you're delivering verbal comments, writing in large blocks of text can usually lead you to losing your place in your page or in your writing, and then causing you to stumble, which ultimately just cuts down on the amount of time you have to speak. Whereas if you provide enough line breaks in your writing, you can more easily find your place if you trip up. Don't be afraid to start over or change your mind or your position halfway through, or even decide that this particular public comment is not for you. And maybe somebody else has a more personal story and you can help them draft their comments. It's okay not to speak on every issue, and it's also okay to change your mind as you're researching and writing. Always check your resources, and by this I mean, do your resources, are they confirmed by other sources? If you can easily find multiple sources that confirm your data, this will just make it easier for decision makers to confirm what you are saying is true. Whereas if only one source is saying what you would like to say, but there are 10 or 12 sources saying the opposite, when decision makers go to do their own research, they're also likely going to see this. So always check your resources. And then watch your word count. The average person can comfortably say about 100 to 150 words per minute. If you go over that, you sound rushed and unprepared. If you go under that, you sound like you're struggling and also unprepared. You want to shoot for that 100 to 150 words per minute. This equates to, in a 3-minute testimony, which is average, 375 to 390 words. So when you're writing, watch your word count, because you don't want to end up running out of time because you've typed too much to begin with. Now for some tips. Number 1 of which, you can do this. Everybody can deliver effective public testimony. It just takes practice. So before the hearing, practice, practice, practice. I cannot stress enough how often we see folks that it is very clear that they did not practice or did not practice out loud. When you're delivering verbal comment, it is vital that you practice out loud. And when I say that, I don't just mean read through the paper in a monotone voice 15 times right before you go into the hearing. I mean, over the course of a few days, set aside some time and practice your public testimony in a variety of ways. Try doing a different inflection on different points. Try emphasizing different words in different sentences. Try doing, and I know this sounds funny, silly voices. It's been proven that practicing in odd voices can actually help you identify where you would like to provide inflection and emphasis when you're delivering the testimony for real. Sign up to speak as early as you can. Sometimes, particularly if public comment is being delivered in person, the lines fill up and the rooms fill up fast. And so it's important to arrive early and to sign up to speak as soon as possible. When arriving in Dover or for a committee hearing or at a public hearing for a permit, if it's in person or virtual, arrive early. But it is absolutely important, particularly for committee hearings in Dover, that you arrive early. The rooms fill up fast, the chairs fill up fast, the opportunity to sign up to speak is removed quickly. You have to arrive early. The last thing that you want to do is to come into a committee hearing, which is generally in a closed, small room, and interrupt the entire hearing. This will not be viewed kindly by the decision makers that you will then have to influence to get on your side. So arrive early. When you're writing, you need to mark down what you are comfortable cutting in the case that time is reduced. Particularly on contentious issues where a lot of people want to comment, it is very common for times to be reduced to as little as 1 minute. So highlight on your page what you are comfortable cutting in different colors to reflect different lengths of time. So that way, before the hearing, you will have a 1 minute, 2 minute, and 3 minute version of your testimony. In the end, you will be able to submit a full written testimony that includes all of your points. But if time's cut, you do not want to be reducing your testimony on the fly. If you're nervous, try what's called a power pose, and you can Google to find out these different power poses. Essentially, one, for example, is what folks call the Superman pose. Fists closed on their hips, chest out, chin up. Deep breaths. This Superman pose and other power poses have been scientifically proven to create endorphin releases that can calm yourself, make you feel more confident, and ultimately help you deliver a more effective testimony. This can last for only 30 to 45 seconds, these poses, and they that quickly can make a chemical difference in your body that can reduce anxiety. You may not want to do this in the committee room itself, though. Before the hearing, try out note cards. Note cards aren't for everybody, but what you want to be cognizant of is when you're delivering your testimony, you're not looking down at a paper or the podium during your entire delivery. Note cards are a great way to help make sure that you're looking up at your decision makers while speaking. The trick with note cards is don't write in full sentences. Write key points and key words that'll jog your memory, because remember, you should have practiced this testimony enough where you've more or less memorized it. So you only need cues to help make sure you keep on track and keep on time. When you're at the hearing, if it's virtual, raise your hand even if you've signed up when it's time to testify. This just helps the moderators find you more easily and unmute you. If you're in person, you do not need to raise your hand. They will call you to the podium or to the table when it's your turn. If you're nervous, take some deep breaths. Keep in mind, you are likely the only one who can tell that you're nervous. Be flexible. It is very common for times in terms of how long you're allowed to testify for, when the testimony will be accepted, what bills go in which order. All of this is subject to change, and it very commonly does change. So you need to be prepared, but you also need to be flexible. After you're done testifying, again, if it's virtual, lower your hand. Again, this makes it easier for the moderators. Always email your testimony, whether you've delivered it verbally in person or virtually. Email your testimony through decision makers, and make sure, though, that you use the right channels when emailing your testimony. These are usually divulged before the comment period begins. Finally, if you're part of an organization, make sure to check back in after you're done, after the committee hearing is done. There may be some after actions that you can take to help amplify your message. My biggest tip for everybody that does testimony, particularly those delivering testimony virtually, is to pretend that your audience can see you, even if they cannot. I know you can't see me right now, but my chest is up, my chin is up, and I'm projecting towards the microphone, which represents you, the audience. Now I am looking down at the podium. My chin is down, my chest is rolled forward, and my inflection has changed dramatically. This is not what you want folks to hear. You want them to hear confidence. You want them to hear your message, not what your body language is conveying through your voice. When you're delivering testimony in person, it's much easier to make sure you're sitting up straight. You have whatever demeanor that you would like to present, whether it's frustrated, happy, supportive, whatever that may be. It's easy to portray that when you know your audience can see you. But in virtual spaces, your camera is often not on by virtue of the Zoom application and the way they set things up. But you must pretend that your audience can see you, because how you position your body comes through in your voice. Some additional tips. Always be professional. Avoid informal language and expletives, because this is ultimately not going to reflect well on your testimony and can influence decision makers whether you agree with that or not. It does. But also, you don't want to be overly complex in your wording. This happens a lot in data-driven testimony. It becomes so complex that decision makers can't follow it, and then they end up just ignoring it. You have to keep in mind, particularly in county and state in terms of legislation, these are not issue area experts that are usually making the decisions on whether a bill or an ordinance moves forward. Unlike permitting decisions, where engineers and scientists often have a direct seat at the table. So just make sure you know your audience and don't become overly complex. Always double check your grammar, because your comment will go on the record and it is accessible to the public. So keep that in mind. Don't overdo your intros. I cannot tell you how many times I have been in a hearing and heard testimony where half of the time was spent with just them introducing themselves. If you only have 3 minutes, you can't spend 90 seconds introducing yourself. One title and one org is enough. Most people in Delaware advocacy circles run in various organizations. Pick the one that matters most to the issue on which you are testifying and stick with that. But do make sure to mention your residency, particularly if you're commenting on state or local issues. They do want to know, if you're testifying on a county matter, that you live in the county, or if you're testifying on a state matter, that you live in Delaware. These things to decision makers definitely matter. Avoid being overly dramatic even when telling personal stories. You do want to give enough detail about what you're experiencing or what your family or close circle has experienced, but speak from an I point of view. Remember, this is your personal story. And avoid prophetic or hearsay comments, also known as chicken little or he said, she said. You need to be able to back up any facts and data that you're interjecting into your story. Always remember that attacks on testifiers or the members of the committee or board in front of which you are testifying will not reflect kindly upon you in the moment or on the record. You can attack the process, but never attack the person, especially other testifiers. You can talk about flaws in the law, or in the process, or even the system as a whole, but I promise you, personal attacks will not win the day with decision makers. On fact-based testimony, be sure to include references or additional information in your written submitted testimony. And when you're delivering verbal testimony, be sure to use in-speech citations. If you're unsure what an in-speech citation is, look it up on Google or other search engine, because it's absolutely vital if you're delivering fact or data-driven testimony that you use in-speech citations effectively. And remember that formatting matters, whether it is a verbal comment or written comment. How you format affects how your testimony is interpreted and how you are effective in delivering it. So make sure you use subheaders to break up sections and visually highlight your most important statements. When you're delivering verbal comment, make sure that you are using bold or all caps for emphasis to make sure that you are emphasizing and putting inflection on the right points that you practiced, identified when you practiced. However, when you're submitting written testimony, only use bold or italics for emphasis. Never all caps. Because this comes across as the people reading it after the fact, when you're not there to know what it means, it comes across as shouting. And when you're submitting written testimony, underline should only be used for links. So let's review. First, you want to pick a type of testimony. Everyone can have a reason to testify in most issues, but only you know what you have to bring to the discussion. So you want to pick a type of testimony and a writing structure you're comfortable with that best matches what you bring to the table. Pick a structure. This structure will help guide your testimony in a linear fashion. They make it easy to follow for decision makers, and they ensure that you're using your time in the most efficient manner possible. Research and reflect. It doesn't matter if you're telling your own story, if you're relying on data and statistics, or if you're doing creative writing. Researching and reflecting on why you want to testify and what you bring to the table and what you want to talk about makes a huge difference. It can make sure that your purpose aligns with what you end up delivering. Reach out for help. This stuff is complicated. No matter what the policy is, somebody in Delaware is working on it. So reach out to your friends and let them help you find more resources. Practice out loud. This is the most important thing that I can say in terms of how to deliver effective testimony. If you've only practiced in your head, I guarantee that you will trip up on a word or two at least, and that in the end you'll be less satisfied with the outcome of your public comment. You must practice out loud beforehand. After you're done, always follow up by submitting your testimony in writing through the proper channels. I know this was a lot of information and it can seem really overwhelming, but I promise you, you can do this. Everybody can deliver effective testimony. Sierra Club and other organizations are here to help. So please, if you have any questions on this presentation or the information within, do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thanks for watching and have a great day.